Darlington was an incredibly busy pit lane. There were a lot of fast stops, but also an incredible amount of mistakes. And playoff pit crews, some of them showed up, some of them had chaos and errors. And we also saw some of the non-playoff crews, now that the pressure is off, they were pushing themselves, and we almost saw a record broken. Let's get into all the details. The first pit stop we're going to start with has to be the big mistake from the number 48 pit crew. We saw in the race, they came in, there was an issue on the right rear, the wheel gun wasn't going, there lack of nitrogen, there just wasn't pressure. So ran back to the wall, and there seemed to be a lot of just chaos and confusion instead of just grabbing the spare wheel gun or just checking the hose or whatever else might have been necessary. And for me, really, the issue wasn't that the wheel gun wasn't working, the issue was that they weren't prepared with the spares. When we saw the tire changer go back to the wall, the pit crew member that was, or the crew member that was on the other side of the wall handed him a wheel gun that wasn't connected to a hose, and there was just a lot of fumbling and a lot of stuff going on. And in my experience, when you get a spare wheel gun, when you get a spare hose, that's stuff that you test before the race. So something happened between their first successful stop and then the second stop where there was no pressure in the hose, and that type of stuff happens, but you have to be prepared. And the fact that they had the wheel gun disconnected and the hose just sitting on the ground, for me at this level, is just not something that you need to do. I've been in those situations in some of the pit stops I've done in IMSA where a wheel gun doesn't work properly. And for us, the preparation before every race is all the spares that you have, you lay them out, and if possible, you test them. And I know that the Hendrick crews have hubs mounted for practice on the side of their pit boxes. So there really isn't any reason to not just hit the hub with each of the wheel guns and just to tap the wheel gun, tap the trigger on the wheel gun before you go up on the wall for a stop, just to make sure that it's working. That's just kind of been my experience. So it was very unfortunate to see that, and that obviously put the 48 behind. I'm sure that they'll have a lot of discussions this week in their review to figure out what went wrong and to figure out how to get some of the basics right. But the other thing I noticed is that there was a lot of nonverbal communication, and typically I'm a proponent of that, but there are options to communicate over systems called intercom systems, which is basically like an open mic where everybody can talk. And in this situation, something like that would have been helpful and would have saved some of the fumbling. They eventually recovered, but that ended up being, I think, 30, 40 second plus pit stop that really just set them back and put them behind the 8 ball for the entire day. The situation with the 24 also almost ended up being disastrous, but experience and preparation there kind of saved the day. So on the 24, on one of their pit stops, they had what looked like on the left side, one of the wheels wasn't seated properly and the car was dropped. But fortunately there, the tire carrier, Ryan Patton, literally jumped on the hood of the car to physically stop William Byron from leaving. And in addition to that, they went on the radio and said, stop, stop, stop. So that was an unfortunate issue, but in that case, it was kind of the opposite of what we saw in the 48, where crew members reacted quickly, they were prepared, and they stopped the car, and it caused minimal time loss. The other two Hendrick cars also had small things here and there that popped up, and that, ranged from stuff that maybe just required adjustments, or maybe just some issues here with wheels going on and off, like some of the other cars we saw. Larson, notably on lap 232, had a long stop because they wanted to make an adjustment. And then things kind of compounded there because once Larson pulled onto pit lane, he got into traffic, and then you had hard charging Ross Chastain that just ran into him, so it slowed things a little bit more. But for the most part, the 5 and the 9 had kind of what I would say an average day on pit lane. It was a similar story for the Joe Gibbs cars. Again, we had one notable, which was the number 11. They had an array of issues that all really started with a slide into the pit box. So Denny Hamlin slid into the box, which kind of threw everybody off. And that's not me making excuses for the pit crew, that's just me showing where the event started. There are situations like that where the driver goes long, and typically, if you recover quickly, you're losing maybe 3 to 5 tenths. But in this situation, they got behind on the right rear wheel. So when the carrier went to do the exchange, they were delayed there, and then they dropped the car. And that's really where the first big time loss happened, because Joel, the jackman, had to go back and rejack the car, and that lost them a period of time there. And then while they were doing that, Dillon now was rushing to catch up, and this was a stop where they had an adjustment. So Dillon had the wedge wrench on his helmet, and unfortunately it dropped out of his hand, so he was chasing that. And typically Dillon is, a top 1 or top 2 tire carrier for most races, and here is just a lot happened, and he dropped the wedge wrench, and a process that typically takes him 1.5 seconds ended up taking 5 seconds, which meant that the carrier on the left front, or the tire changer on the left front, was waiting now for Dillon to come back and hang that tire. And what that resulted in is just kind of a bunch of events that added up that doubled their pit stop time on that single pit stop. To make matters worse, I think Denny wanted to show some of his displeasure, because even once they completed the pit stop, he sat there for another 2 or 3 seconds before taking off. And that really didn't make a huge difference because they were already behind the field. But there was just a bunch of stuff that stacked up, and it all started with a small mistake from the driver that could have cost maybe 0.3 of a second, that ended up compounding into being 9 or 10 seconds. So that's just another example of, you gotta kind of go back to basics sometimes, and in this situation they just really missed it. Going to the number 20 car, they seemed to do pretty well for most of the race. Their most obvious was their impact on pit lane, and that's really nothing to do with the pit crew. They had, I believe, one stop where they kind of had an issue on the right rear doing the exchange, but outside of that, they had, again, what I would consider an average day. The number 19 pit crew had an exceptional day. They basically averaged pit stops in the 8-second range all day, and they were smooth and consistent. It was wild to see that all of their 9 pit stops were within 3 or 4 tenths of each other. That's, for a long race like the Southern 500, that's incredibly impressive. And that's part of the reason why Chase was able to stay out front. And in races like these, where track position is so significant, that just gets you up front and gets you the results you need to win races like this, or to be in contention for the win at the end of the race, as Chase was. That number 19 pit crew has really been just on it the last few races. They seem to have gone in the opposite progression of the number 11, where the number 11 started hot and now things have slowed down a little bit. The number 19, I would say, started a little bit on the average side, but now they're just like hitting on all cylinders. And I think that their helpfulness on pit lane, helping multiple other cars with their loose wheels, maybe has earned them some good karma. So all of that combined has just brought them impressive performances. And although that pit crew was shuffled a few years ago, most of the crew members have been around now at least for 2 or 3 years. Most notably, you have Lee Cunningham, who's a veteran tire changer, somebody that I would consider a leader of that group. He's on the front. The only change that group has had is they acquired Daniel Smith from Stewart-Haas Racing. So he's kind of the new guy that slotted in on the rear as the tire changer. And I think that's what took them some time to warm things up. They all got used to each other, but now that they're all working so well together, the team is just so smooth. Then you have Caleb Dirks on the jack, you have CJ Bailey as the carrier, and then you have Matt Tyrrell as the fueler. So really just some really good and fast guys that are now showing their skill set and are going to help Chase Briscoe proceed further into the playoffs. The 2311 cars had kind of a medium day on pit lane. The 23 was pretty smooth. They had a lot of fast stops, as they've shown this year, and they had something that I would consider a recovery, where they had at one point an issue on the right rear, similar to what they had at Richmond. But in this case, you could see that they've studied this, and in that situation, they slowed down. They didn't lose a bunch of time, but they made sure that the right rear was fully tight, the left front was fully tight, and sent the car back out. And that, of course, put Bubba in a position to finish right there at the edge of the top 5 and really put him in contention. And I think you could see the effort from the whole group. Just even listening to the radio after one of those stops, you could see that Bubba takes a different approach now than what might have, been heard in previous years, where, he saw that something slowed down the stop and he basically said, hey, we're going to go make up some stops on the track. And that's exactly what he did. He went out there, even though he lost a few spots on pit lane, he had a good restart and they kind of worked their way back forward. The 45 obviously was involved in that very early incident. So the pit crew had a lot of work. The first thing they had to do once he came in is reset that roof flap, because there was fabric that was hanging out, and it looked like they also reset the diffuser flap at the rear. The reason they needed to do that is because the roof flap is connected to the diffuser flap via cable. So whenever the roof flaps fully deploy, they also deploy the diffuser flap. And that's likely what caused the ill handling issues for Reddick until he came in. That incident also appeared to damage the left side jack post. So Damian Jackson, who's the jack man on that car right now, had a challenge not only on that stop, but on the stops for the rest of the race, where he basically had to kind of work around and find an area that was stiff enough on the left side of the car each time they did a stop. So it was impressive to see that they were still pretty consistent for the rest of the race and able to challenge almost all the way to the end for the lead. The Penske playoff cars, the number 2 of Austin Cindric, was kind of a pretty, I would say, average to slightly above average day. They had some decent stops. The only thing I really noticed that, stood out was on lap 153. They had a right rear delay. I couldn't tell from the camera whether that was on the exchange or whether they were doing an adjustment. But other than that, it was just kind of, a decent, solid day. The 12 car Blaney obviously had multiple things happen. It all kind of started on lap 153, where they lost a bunch of time because the 77 and 20 collided right in front of them. So the car was stuck in the box. That lost them some spots and put them in traffic. And then eventually later on, they had the on-track incident, so they had to come in for repairs. And the pit crew did what they needed to do, but unfortunately, in this situation, there was a lot of stuff outside of their control that affected their day. The 22, similar situation, fairly consistent. I believe around lap 315, they had a slight delay on the right side. Again, this could be just the exchange, and the right rear might have been slow, which was common with a lot of guys, especially some of those that might have gotten to the wall, or maybe they wanted an adjustment for late in the race. So other than that, nothing terribly notable for the 22. Going to the affiliate Wood Brothers car, obviously Josh Berry was involved in an incident early on in the race, so there wasn't really much to write home about there as far as pit stops, because they spent a lot of the race fixing the car from the damage they sustained early on. But we'll see in the next race if they have an opportunity to rebound and come back and put down some decent stops. Number 3 of Austin Dillon also had kind of what I would consider an average race on pit lane. They had some decent stops. They also had a couple of slowdowns, and some of it was related to strategy. They had a slow right rear from the lap 117. So again, that could be on the tire exchange or it could be an adjustment. And then on lap 153, they looked like they were chasing an alternate strategy. So they sat the car in the box for an additional 2 or 3 seconds to get it really full of fuel. But outside of that, pit stops were good for that crew. I expect them to be able to contend on pit stops in the next couple of races. And it's really all just going to be dependent if they chase something like these alternate fuel strategies. Moving on to the Trackhouse cars, the number 88 of Shane Van Gisbergen probably had the most eventful day on pit lane. And most of it wasn't related to the performance of the pit crew. Shane was unhappy with the handling of the car, so they were throwing so many changes at it. And on lap 118, they decided to do a big adjustment on the left front, basically to change the balance of the car, change some rounds. And that resulted in a 54-second pit stop. And going back and looking at the tape, I can see that it was all just on the adjustment. The pit crew did what they needed to on the right, what they needed to do on the right side. And once they got over to the left, they let one of the behind-the-wall mechanics hop over and make adjustments to that left front suspension. They had similar adjustments later on lap 205. That was another 35-second stop, same type of situation. Left front wheel off, mechanic in there making tweaks, making adjustments. And that's, maybe changing rounds or maybe, changing shock settings, who knows. But the car was very ill handling based on SVG's description, so they threw a lot at it. The rest of the stops that were more regular also featured a lot of that, where they made adjustments, but maybe not as significant. So, they had some stops that were in the 10, 11 second range. And a lot of that was also because they had to stick a wrench in the back of it or do some other things. So I wouldn't really judge the performance of the 88 pit crew just based on this single race, because most of it wasn't really up to them. The other Trackhouse playoff car, the number 1 of Ross Chastain, has a new Jackman and Josh Appleby, number 1 Jackman in the series. So a lot was expected from them, and they've delivered. All race long, they delivered until they got towards the end and had an issue on the left rear. From what I could see from the camera footage, the stop went smooth on the right side. They came over to the left side. The changer pulled the tire off, and as the fueler rolled that tire that was discarded, it looked like his foot might have gotten caught on the hose of the wheel gun for that left rear changer, which resulted in the wheel gun getting jammed by not being able to reach back to the car. So that 1.5 or 2 seconds that the left rear changer had to reposition the wheel gun is what caused the slowdown on that pit stop. But for the remainder of the race, they really were excellent. So I'm sure that's something that they'll review on tape and make sure that the foot positioning is proper going forward, so they don't have any more of those errors. Speaking of Trackhouse, the Trackhouse trained pit crews that are not in the playoffs were competing for some of the fastest stops of the race. Most notably, the pit crew that's on the number 16 of AJ Allmendinger was hitting 8-second stops basically all race. And at one point, they hit an 8.1 second stop that allowed Allmendinger to go from entering pit lane in 15th to exiting in 8th. And that group just showed off just with their consistency and speed all night, because not only were they hitting pit stops in the 8s, they didn't make mistakes. So every one of those pit stops that they did all night long was in that same range. That number 16 group has been shuffled a little bit this year. There's a couple of guys that were retained from last year, most notably Austin Holland, who's the front tire changer. He became famous recently for his dance moves during the Daytona broadcast. And then fueler Michael Dusky. And then rear changer Jarek Newsom, Jackman Marshall McFadden, and tire carrier Brendan Foley were leased out into other groups or on other Trackhouse teams. So they've spent time most recently on the 71 car last year, and then some of them were also kind of on the one-off cars. As an example, Brendan Foley was tire carrier for SVG during his first Chicago street course win, and then Dusky was with AJ for his recent Roval win. So they've been kind of bounced back and forth between either Trackhouse or leased out to colleagues. So it's really interesting to see those guys now up their game and be able to put down some of those impressive stops. The other pit crew that had a similar performance was the number 42 pit crew of John Hunter Nemechek. They were in a similar average to that number 16 pit crew and actually had their fastest pit stop of the year. They were just a few tenths off those guys, but the number 42 crew was able to hit their fastest stop of the year at 8.51 seconds. And that really propelled John Hunter to the front of the field, allowing him to compete with some of these other drivers and allowing him and his teammate Eric Jones to get a really decent finish in this race. Eric Jones obviously is well versed at Darlington, so it's no surprise to see him up front, but seeing both legacy cars I think was a surprise for some. And I think part of that is the pit crew performance, and part of that I think is Eric sharing some of his knowledge with John Hunter to help both of them be up front. With the pit crews there, the number 43 pit crew has seen some shuffles this year, most notably with very young athletes joining from their PDG program. Dante Johnson was the front tire changer there at Darlington. Zane Dickey was the rear tire changer. So they both only have a handful of races, but to see them perform at that level and to perform consistently just shows how well they've been able to put everything together. Even though that 43 crew has been shuffled, they still have some veterans around, most notably Jackman, Kellen Mills. He's been on multiple winning teams and multiple championship organizations. So it's no surprise that he's kind of taken a leadership role there. But even speaking with Kellen recently, he's telling me that through all his years of experience, he's still learning. And with somebody like Dante and Zane coming in, he's now learning from them because they haven't been exposed to some of the old habits, which is making them faster. The biggest story of the non-playoff teams for me was the number 17 pit crew of Chris Buescher just knocking out some pit stops out of the park. They were similarly consistent to some of these other pit crews I mentioned, but the big thing that stood out for me for that number 17 RFK Racing pit crew of Chris Buescher is that at one point in the race, they were able to knock out an 8.06 second for tire change, which based on my record keeping puts them second fastest of all time, only behind the 8.02 second pit stop set by the number 11 crew at the Coke 600, and now ahead of the 8.09 second pit stop set by the number 23 pit crew at Kansas. And that's what really excites me about what we're seeing here recently, is that there are a lot of pit crews stepping up to the plate, and now they're chasing 100. And I believe that we're very close now to seeing a pit stop in the 7-second range, because we're right on that edge, just a few hundredths away. And for what I've seen in practice, which obviously has perfect conditions, there are teams that have hit 7.3s and 7.4s. So seeing one in the race before the end of the year would not surprise me. I really enjoyed watching all the pit lane action at Darlington. For me, as somebody that really appreciates those details, it really felt like drinking from a fire hose, because there were so many storylines at any given point in the race, whether there was green flag pit stops, yellow flag pit stops and stage breaks, adjustments being thrown out there, pit crews that usually are in the spotlight stepping up and performing. It just was a very enjoyable race to watch. And it really showed just how much of a part pit crews play in pushing cars further in the playoffs and eventually leading to that final 4 round, and how much they will play once they get there to help propel their drivers to the front. Please like and subscribe, leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, and I'll try to keep doing more of these.